Okay, so we're a small group today, but we are here to talk about the introduction and or what is usually called the background section of your manuscript. So I'd like to welcome everyone and apologize for any confusion over the time zones, but there you have it. Jess, I think we're going to go ahead and record this session.
Yes, we are recording.
Great. Okay, next slide. So the, what is the purpose of the introduction or the background section? And really there are a couple of functions to this area. Most importantly, it's going to introduce the topic of your research or review paper to your audience. And by the end of this section, you're going to have your purpose stated and some specific aims stated. The literature review will provide the background for your work and will discuss any controversies which may assist in providing justification for why you are doing it. The other thing about the background or introduction section is when you submit your paper to a journal, the peer reviewers are going to expect to see certain elements within this section. And we'll talk about those specific elements in a few minutes. But ideally, this gives your target audience an understanding of the context of your paper and your project. Next slide. So again, before you think about, even starting to write this section, you need to think about where you're going to submit your paper. And I think this is a theme that you're going to hear over and over throughout this workshop, that you need to know the journal and you need to know the author guidelines. But really, one of the key points in the author guidelines, it's going to give you an idea of the length of the paper that they will accept. And generally, these are between 3,000 and 5,000 words. And the important thing about this is that it's going to serve as an indication as to how long your introduction should be. You don't want to end up writing a 10-page introduction when the number of pages that can be submitted are 8 to a particular journal, for example. Again, you always want to check the correct referencing style, whether it's going to be numerical or APA style, because this will have indications as to the length as well. And you don't want to use the wrong style for the journal and find out that we'll send it back to you. And I will tell you that that is a very common reason for our journal to return manuscripts even before we send them out to review, because we're not going to send a paper out to review if it hasn't followed our author guidelines. So, to highlight the elements of the background in the introduction section, again, this is where we're going to see the literature review. This is where we're going to see, and you may want to present any knowledge or perhaps policy gaps. And then, as I mentioned, we're always going to end with the purpose and specific aims of your project or your paper. Next slide. So I think one of the issues that come up is that you cannot just simply describe the substance or behavior being studied. I think that authors often, when they say drug use is a worldwide problem, that we then implies that research is needed. And, this is really untrue. There should not be a volume of loosely related information making the reader feel lost and wonder, what is all this information for? And I think we want to avoid arguments that have already been resolved and that are not pertinent to your paper, even though you may have spent months on this research and feel you have the answer. I think this highlights a really important point for those of you who may be working with PhD students and trying to get a dissertation ready for publication. And of course, within the dissertation process, we're asking students to include everything about a relevant topic. And of course, to get these papers published in a journal, we don't have the luxury of that much space. So I think that really when talking about the problem, you want to discuss the significance of the problem, the extent of the problem, and to me, money talks, and always kind of highlighting the cost of the problem in terms of society or economic implications. And then you want to kind of think about summarizing what is known about the problem, including relevant previous studies. And generally, these are related to concepts that you're going to be looking at in terms of population intervention and outcomes. Next slide. So a couple of tips for the introduction and background section is really we should be thinking about going from the general and coming down into the specifics. So, you want to introduce the topic and setting in its context and avoid starting with obvious statements. For example, drug use is a worldwide problem. Everybody pretty much knows this. But, if you had a statement, if you were looking at, say, drug use in hospitalized patients, and you had a statement that said, 60% of hospitalized patients have a history of drug use. This is much more specific and relevant to what you're going to be then presenting. The topic should be introduced as being important and should also identify where the research is taking place. And again, you're building the case for why you're doing what you're doing. And at the end of your background section will be your precise research purpose, your specific aims, or your research question. So again, we start generally and we are drilling down into the very specifics of what you're looking at. You want to make sure that your literature is balanced. And I think, for beginning authors, it may be easy to make reference to those articles that support what you want to do. But it's also important to present the other side of the story. And again, this can just help to build the case for why you're doing what you're doing. But in general, the purpose is a description of the essence of the paper and includes, again, the population, the intervention, and the outcomes. And the specific aims generally describe what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and what you expect to find. So again, the purpose is a little bit broader than your specific aims, which is typically what we end up with in this section. Next slide. In terms of your introduction and background, you do want to make sure that the points that you're making are referenced, and you really don't want to be making a lot of statements in the introduction or background that cannot be backed up by references. And of course, you want to make sure that you're quoting the source accurately, as this becomes the justification for why you're doing what you're doing. And, you know, it is interesting that people will misquote, even though, you know, you have your point in a particular paper. People have been known to misquote others' references. And so one of the things we always want to do is make sure that all authors are using primary sources. I think another tip here is you don't need to use, you know, numerous references for each point, especially if you're doing APA style and you're using authors instead of numbers. This will really begin to take up a lot of space. And once you see 4 or 5 references at the end of a sentence, you kind of lose track of, you know, the flow of the paper. So I think the important thing here is to think about the important references that you want to use, and use the others sparingly. And again, I think this is a difficult thing for PhD students in particular, when they've done so much work pulling all that literature together, you know, for the lit review chapter of their dissertation. And, you know, sometimes it's harder to delete words than to add words into a paper. So next slide. Again, this is, you know, within the dissertation, the lit review is a chapter in of itself, and does present the context of your research. And now it's time to think about that lit review, and how can we take part of that from perhaps a dissertation and summarize it so that the most important references that are going to lead to what your specific aims are and what your methods are going to be. So you want to keep the topics of your lit review grouped so that the flow is logical, and that the reader is able to very easily follow from step A to step B to step C, and actually see your thinking through the literature that you present into, you know, how you decided to do your project the way you did. Next slide. So in summary, just a couple of things to keep in the back of your mind. You know, if the introduction is disorganized and does not flow from general to specific, or if I see a paper with a background section of 10 pages, it, you know, is simply too long to be able to be useful for publication in a paper. The other common mistake is that we're trying to include so many issues in this section that we really want to keep the focus on what is most relevant to this particular paper, and to making the decision points that you did for your paper. When again, a common mistake is quoting too many references for each point. It just becomes too confusing for people to read through when you have many, many references. Yeah, it may not provide a balanced argument, ignoring papers that do not agree with your point of view. And again, I think, you know, for beginning folks that may be starting out to think about publishing papers, is, you know, that can be a little daunting when you're, you know, quoting something that doesn't agree with you. But again, really, if A is showing this and B is showing that, it really is building your argument for why you made your decisions. Again, being poorly referenced and not having enough references is an issue. Again, length, very, very important to keep in the back of your mind. And, you know, as we always say, if you have a colleague, it would be great to get their feedback before actually making the submission. Because we can be thinking that we have the clearest background in the world and give it to somebody else to read, and they may be saying, I'm not seeing the connection here. And so you can really get some valuable feedback from your colleagues. So I think, is there another slide? Okay. So comments, questions about this section?
Can I just add something, or just really reinforce? Thank you very much, Anne, for that. One of the common things you will have, and Anne's mentioned it several times, is that you will have students doing master's degrees and PhDs, and we clearly want to publish them, and that's they should be published. But they too often try to submit a dissertation without cutting it down to paper length. And I think she made the point early on that what you need for the literature review on a dissertation for a PhD is a lot longer than you need for a paper. And that is really important. And those will be quite common things at university level among your students, that you really need to think about that.
Yes, thank you, Anne. I really liked it too. It was very clear and comprehensive. I just wanted to maybe go over a couple of things. I like the idea, and I don't think everybody thinks about this in the introduction. It's where you have your aims and purpose of you know, where you're going with this paper. And the context, it provides context. It really helps the author, the writer in some ways as well as the reader to do that. And to keep in mind, like as Anne mentioned, on to review the author guidelines, and particularly for two things: the length of the paper, what the length that they require, and referencing style. It's very rare that we've had papers that are too short. They're usually always too long. Why? Because it's very hard to make things concise and clear at the same time. I find that to be the most difficult thing about writing, and that's one of the things I really like in Publishing Addiction Science, is that they were able to take complex topics and make them concise. So if you really want to see what that's like, again, check out that book. And I like what Anne said about building a case as to what you're planning to do. So it supports that, and also to discuss papers briefly that are with the opposite view or opposing. And again, primary sources, key, and logical flow. Those were the key things I got from Anne's presentation. Thank you again.
Yeah, you guys got me thinking about another common, I don't know, common conception, and that is not to use references older than 5 years, so that you're quoting and referencing new literature generally within a 5-year period. Although I always say, unless you want to also include that quote of the most important study that has been done to date, that happened back in the 80s. So it is okay to use those classic quotes if it adds to the background of your paper. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, generally people use that 5-year rule.
Classical papers are important. I don't have as much trouble with that unless the paper is inundated with in very old, older papers. I think it's important in the biological sciences to keep within that 5-year limit. But I don't always think it's relevant all the time for the humanities and the social sciences. But I'm not as, I find I get a little bit, I have a little bit of a problem with the whole 5-year thing, but I do see the importance of it because sometimes people are not up to date with their references and where the science is going. So that's important.
Right.
On the other hand,
You know,
Yeah.
the other thing, now that I'm thinking about it is if you remember back in one of our first sessions, we talked about the importance of reading those author guidelines, and that if you don't, and your paper is being sent back to you even before you get the reviews because you haven't followed those guidelines, the only thing you're doing is adding months onto the timeline that your paper is going to get published. And depending on how your reviews go and how many revisions there are, this could, there are papers that will take you maybe 9 months to get published, or a year, or maybe 2 years. And then, so you always have to keep in the back of your mind, is there any new literature coming up that I need to include in these revisions now?
good point.
Because
Yeah.
time will go by quickly.
I think that those points are very relevant. I think in terms of the age of references, some of my work, I've referred back to work, historical work, and obviously one uses historical references. I think the thing that stands out is when people have only used references that are 6 or 7 years old and clearly haven't looked at what the current state of play is in a certain field. I think that is very relevant.
Mhm.
I think one of the other things I was going to say, and I'm finding this increasingly for some reason, is that some people, rather than just restrict the literature review to the introduction section, I suddenly find in the discussion section they're introducing new material. Now, if it is related to the findings, then that's fine. But sometimes you find that there's a mixture of literature from both the introduction and the discussion. So the introduction should be what setting the scene, and you shouldn't have a discussion full of new literature. Sorry, it's one of my little bones of contention.
Oh, that's a good point, Richard. That's a very